This is Robert Clotworthy, the narrator of The Curse of Oak Island, and I have a question for you. Could it be that you are listening to The Curse of Oak Island and Beyond live stream?
This is a top pocket find, mate, for sure.
All right, we are live. Hey, welcome everybody to the Curse of Oak Island and Beyond live stream. I am your host, Jeff Freeman, and right over here I have my returning as my special co-host tonight, John Edwards. John, how you doing tonight?
Hey, great, Jeff. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well. Hey, for the folks out there, we've got a pretty good show lined up for you tonight. I can't wait to bring our guest on, which we'll do here in just a couple moments. But before we do, some of you may not know exactly who John Edwards is. And so I'd like to give John an opportunity to kind of introduce himself to you all. And he's become a staple on the show here for us. And he's going to be working with me on some new ventures coming up and also some current ones that we're doing. But welcome to the show, John. Give us a little information about who you are and what you do.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm a teacher by trade. I've been teaching for 27 years in the public school system, but my avocation is as a researcher and a theorist. I do a lot of research. My focus is on pedagogical or educational uses of symbols and icons during the age of exploration. It fascinates me. Comparative religions, mythology, Templar history, and Christian and Jewish studies. So I kind of delve into all those kind of relationships in and amongst those ideas. Mm-hmm. And as you've heard me say, and my catchphrase is, there is a line of thought. So you might hear me say that quite a bit tonight, but so a lot of it's just fascinating to me, and just looking at not symbolism necessarily, but symbols, and looking and comparing symbols amongst cultures and amongst different sites and things of that sort. So, it's just fascinating. So a little bit about me.
Yep, and they are fascinating too. And those symbols, we're going to talk about a little bit of those later on tonight with Cort, because they are, and they mean so much, and they go so much deeper. We had some other folks on Beyond Oak Island. We had Warren Gettler and Holly Remkis that were working with symbols that had to do with the Rebel Gold and what was going on there, the Knights of the Golden Circle. So, those symbols are fascinating, and they sometimes date back a lot of years, but we'll get into more of that as we go along. Hey, for folks, for those of you that are out watching on our YouTube page, we appreciate it if you would hit that subscribe button for us. And if you want to know about interesting shows and things that we got coming up, click on that notification bell, and you will be notified as soon as we have new content on the show. What I would like to do right now is go ahead and bring on our special guest tonight. This gentleman is a author. He is a researcher for many, many years on many, many subjects. And he was also, I found out just recently that he was also, worked for many years as an archaeologist. Give it up for Cort Lindahl. Welcome, Cort. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you all? Mm-hmm. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's an honor to have you come on here tonight. And as we get started, Cort, I would like to find out a little bit about Cort Lindahl. I know that I've been talking to you for quite a while now, but many of our guests, our people, our viewers that are watching here tonight, we know that you were on Oak Island. You were on the show, and I think you had the #1 theory, if I remember correctly. Is that right?
Right, in the top 25 theory special that they did. Mine, I was surprised as anyone else that they ranked mine #1, because there's a lot of good theories out there that when that happened, I was very surprised.
Yeah, and it was, I tell you what, and it's one that I'm really fascinated about. We're going to get into that in just a moment. But tell us a little bit about, you were an archaeologist. I know you've written several books. We know you've got a lot of YouTube videos out there talking about some of your research. But tell us a little bit about this archaeology. When was that?
Well, beginning in about 1981, I became a field archaeologist. I wasn't really a professor or an academic archaeologist, but I'd taken field schools in college and just started to do that as a vocation on contract archaeology. So, excuse me, like when they're building a highway or a gas line or something like that, those areas would be checked out for cultural resources.
Right.
And during that time, I worked for the state of Virginia for a while, worked on some really interesting colonial sites where body armor was found, and other interesting early colonial artifacts in the area of Jamestown. And that was a real thrill. And I didn't know how impressive that was when I was doing it, because it was some of the first things I had done. We worked on the Williamsburg gallows where Blackbeard's crew had been hung and things like that.
Right.
So I just did it as a job for many years, and eventually moved out here to California and did it, and just quit doing that about 10 years ago due to an injury I had on the job. So
Oh, wow.
that's when I started writing.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
Right. And my first kind of thesis or thing that I was working on involved why had Thomas Jefferson built octagonal structures. And little did I know how that would feed in later to become a legitimate thing. I just kind of sensed that it might be important and started to look into that. And sure as heck, here, even later in my research, it's very applicable to a lot of the things I found.
Right. So that seems like that's kind of what got you interested into looking into this stuff. Is that right?
Yeah.
And doing some of the research. Yeah. Wow.
Right. So I looked into the history of all these kind of structures and things like that. Right. And I lived in Williamsburg. I went to high school in that area. So the Powder magazine there, the octagonal structure in Williamsburg, was always a point of curiosity, just in why did they do that? Exactly. And that was part of the reason I started to look into that later, in association with Thomas Jefferson, who built Poplar Forest, which is kind of a copy of the Dome of the Rock, and Monticello, which is vaguely designed like the Daphne Palace of Constantine the Great, which also had a central octagonal room in it.
Yeah.
So he was working on a tradition there in his architectural designs.
And that's neat how you've been able to put all these things together and tie them together. And we're gonna talk about those a little bit here too as we go along. And I've got some pictures that you've sent to me of those very items. So as we go along here, I'll be showing those. Let's take us real quick over to Oak Island. Now, I know that as we know, you were on the show and you talked about your theory there. And that theory, I guess what it was called, Lost and Founding. Was that what it was?
Yes, and it involves the founding fathers and American possible influence in the Oak Island story, which did kind of just blossom out into a lot of really rational reasons that could be as the research went on. And in the history of Nova Scotia, for instance, a lot of American colonists came up there and fought in the sieges of Louisbourg and other historical events up there. The former governor of Virginia, Francis Nicholson, who helped to design the street plan of Williamsburg, was later the governor of Nova Scotia. And then we also had the colonial planters, who were people from the American colonies that were given land in Nova Scotia. And this included famous American families like the Longfellow family of the famous poet, John Allen, who's distantly related to Edgar Allan Poe, and even the Delano family of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the American president. So a lot of these people maintained a loyalty to the 13 colonies during the American Revolution. And at that time, many of them even came and fought for the colonies against the English during the American Revolution. And a lot of them even became members of the Society of the Cincinnati, which is a group of American officers from the Revolution that formed kind of the closest thing that the United States has to a knighthood after the war. So there were even some members up there, John Allen being one of them, who were in the Society of the Cincinnati. And even during the war, he had written letters to President or George Washington asking him for assistance in invading Nova Scotia or funding a rebellion there as well. So there was an active movement starting at that time to make Nova Scotia part of what would become the United States.
Right.
And this sentiment kind of lasted well into the 1800s and the latter 1800s, leading to the appeal to heaven design, and that design being on the Evans Stone there on Oak Island. So it could have meaning towards that, because there were movements even as late as the 1880s to try to make Nova Scotia part of the United States.
That's kind of what I was thinking too. And I know Judy Rudabush even mentioned on here that Benjamin Franklin also owned land on Nova Scotia, did he not?
Yes, he did. He was given a 20,000 acre land grant there. I forget the name of the town, but there's a specific town in Nova Scotia that encompassed the area that he was awarded. So there's kind of a personal motivation for Ben Franklin even to want Nova Scotia to be part of the United States later as well. So, and really a lot of the kind of American connections go back as far as the Baron of Nova Scotia himself.
Who was, go ahead, tell us.
Right. Well, we know that him and his sons attempted to form a Scottish colony there under the auspices of first James I and Charles I and so on. That didn't really take hold or was successful, but they awarded all these baronetcies to people along with land grants in Nova Scotia at that time. But what's interesting about the Baron is that being he was so closely associated with Charles I, after Charles I was beheaded during that period, and then in between the time Charles II then became king again when they reestablished the monarchy just 15 years later or so, that a lot of the exiled cavaliers or supporter of Charles I came to the American colonies in exile. And this included people like Thomas Beale, who later is part of the Beale treasure story from that family. And he was also a Knight of Malta, which was kind of rare at that time for an Englishman to be a member of the Order of Malta. But it also included most of the remaining family of the Baron of Nova Scotia, specifically the descendants of his brother, who now had the rights to the titles of the Baron of Nova Scotia and the Earl of Stirling. So what's interesting about that is that William Alexander, another general in the American Revolution prior to the war, had attempted to claim the titles of Baron of Nova Scotia and Earl of Stirling. And it's interesting because the Scottish peerage awarded him these titles, but kind of understandably in that era, the British Parliament turned it down because they could see the writing on the wall of the revolution coming and disputes with America. And this would have made it a lot easier for Nova Scotia to have become a state after the establishment of the United States. So that's an interesting aspect of that. Other parts of his family were the founders and namesakes of Alexandria, Virginia,
right,
which was within the original boundaries of Washington, D.C., and they had a lot of influence in the establishment of Washington, D.C. at that time, a little later. And even there's records of one of them, Stephen Alexander, being offered being the Baron of Nova Scotia that he turned down. So there's a lot of interesting connections that do relate to the possibility that Americans could have been involved in the Oak Island story, not the least of which what we'll get to in a little while is how President Jefferson is actually related to Philip Sidney, who wrote his famous book Arcadia.
Yeah, we're definitely going to be jumping into that
absolutely.
Too. I wanted to ask you real quick, so about Oak Island, and we, about the whole in the American Revolution. One of the things that was really curious to me was, and I think you kind of alluded to this on the show when you were on the Curse of Oak Island, was that now do you believe that there is or was a treasure on Oak Island, and what do you think became of it if it's no longer there?
I think it's still possible something is there. That's kind of a toss-up question, really.
I know.
There could be something there, but there's a lot of indication that in a lot of the things that are, have come up on the show, like the Danville expedition.
Yes.
That the payroll from that could be involved, or the payrolls from Fortress Louisbourg from the two sieges of that. And I did find some interesting information that the same man Jean Laborde was the treasurer of Fortress Louisbourg during the Second Siege, and he had also earlier been the treasurer for the D'Anville expedition.
Really? No, I did not know that. I'm not familiar with him. Who? Explain who he is a little bit, if you don't mind.
Well, his name's Jean Laborde, and he was stationed or part of the garrison there at Fortress Louisbourg, and he was the treasurer. So he kept track of all the accounts and had a staff of accountants and things like that, I'm sure. But what's interesting about him is after the second siege of Louisbourg, he was accused of misappropriating what would be worth $150 million today.
Oh, my goodness.
And so eventually, through a series of events, he paid half of that back. So there's at least still half of that missing somewhere in the ether. And we see that during that era of history, the British sea captains were allowed to keep a large portion of whatever spoils they captured during times of war.
Right.
So there's even the possibility that some of that was hidden on Oak Island for a period of time, that they had difficulty getting to it due to the kind of the changing winds of in Acadia, that France owns it now, England owns it now. It went back and forth a lot, and a lot of French people still stayed there even during the times that England controlled it. So it may have been difficult for them to recover something like that.
Right.
But what that really leads us to is the interesting similarities between the construction of the money pit and the presence of the 90-foot stone that were mentioned in a book that was first printed in 1580.
Yes. Go ahead. Go ahead, John.
I was going to say it's very similar to the Enochian vaults, and Cort, you and I have discussed that before. I would love to hear your thoughts on. I know you have a book called Oak Island and the Arcadian Mysteries. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the 90-foot stone, the Enochian vaults, if there's a similarity. And also, you had mentioned, and we had talked briefly about it, a pirate by the name of Peter Easton, who also had a money pit story in Newfoundland. I wonder if you could tie kind of those ideas together for us.
Sure. Well, first of all, the story that's in Philip Sidney's book, Arcadia, involves a treasure pit situated beneath an oak tree. And as part of the story, they dig down into the pit and they encounter a stone that's described like a tombstone, a squared off carved stone that had what's termed Aristomenes' box atop the stone. So in Greek mythology, Aristomenes was a general in the land of Arcadia who buried a treasure in Arcadia. And the treasure he buried may have been a votive statue of Pallas Athena. In some versions of the story, in another version, it was a tablet that described the Eleusinian mysteries, which is a kind of very mysterious part of Greek mythology that nobody really knows what those were comprised of. So a tablet that displayed this would have been considered of value. And that's why Sidney probably included it in the plot of the book. So in the book, the box is full of poetry and parchments, similar to things that they have found at depth on Oak Island, pieces of parchment and book bindings or pieces of leather and things like that. But the tombstone mentioned is kind of analogous to the 90-foot stone. And even in the story in the book, it was said to cover the entrance to a vault where a treasure would be. So the similarities in this story to the way the Oak Island story is told in the story of the three young men is kind of surprising, in that it goes back a lot of time in history to where there was a huge value of Arcadia and the Arcadian concept that really goes far back into Roman history, even via the value of the poet Virgil, who defined the Arcadian theme in pastoral poetry for the first time, that later became kind of a mania of aristocrats in Europe and royalty. And that's possibly could lead us to the reason why the money pit seems to be constructed, as you pointed out, reminiscent of the 9-layered vault of Enoch that has the golden triangle at the bottom with the the tetragrammaton on that, the unspoken name of God. That is, during the era in the later 1700s was a big Masonic concept and Solomonic concept, how Enoch is involved in the story of Solomon. So some of the same themes leading to more modern Freemasonry were also involved in Sidney's book, in his description of the money pit in the book.
Which is very, very reminiscent of the 13th degree of Masonry that Alan Butler discussed in one of the Oak Island episodes, with the money pit being a threshing floor and then the 9 layers going down. Very reminiscent of the Enochian Bolt story, very reminiscent of Arcadia. So it's kind of an ongoing theme over and over again, almost like it's an esoteric truth that's being taught over and over and over again.
Sure. So later, people who were familiar with that, Freemasons, would look at that story and kind of have an identification with it, that they knew it resembled that story. And even previous to that, this unusual value of Philip Sidney's book in English royalty was also known by all of their associates and people who lionized Philip Sidney. He had an unusual amount of admiration for him as he passed away in 1586. He died in battle in the Netherlands, and he just became kind of this legendary literary figure and representative of English culture to them, involving Arcadia, which is also highly valued by French royalty and other groups like the famous de Medici family of Florence. That this, over time, Virgil even came to be recognized kind of like Nostradamus, that they would use his work by applying bibliomancy, or the random selection of a page that would answer whatever question they had, like a form of divination. So over time, Virgil just became valued to that degree. And the theme of Arcadia, that we see organizations like the Academy of Arcadia of the Vatican being formed, and it even became ingrained in the stories of Rennes-le-Château, associated with other lost treasures like the temple treasure and concepts like that over time. So the treasure association with Arcadia is no surprise that then the story of the 3 young men does resemble the story in Sidney's book.
Yep. Yeah. And that's what Jake Roberts had brought that up here with the talking about the 3 sojourners.
And what's interesting about that, Cort, is it's almost as if, because we know McGinnis was in his 30s, early 30s, when he actually did make it to Nova Scotia, and he was given a land grant by the Crown. But it's almost as if the money pit story has been retrofitted to actually fall into the kind of theme or the monomyth of the other stories.
Sure,
very much
have been done at various times. You're right.
Sure.
I mean, we're looking at a time span that goes back to Philip Sidney, who was giving a land grant in Acadia. Sir Humphrey Gilbert. This is in the early 1580s, late 1570s. So it was originally claimed by England at that time. And it's interesting because there's even this really scant source that claims Sir Humphrey Gilbert found gold in Nova Scotia. But then when you look into that deeper, there's no proof he was ever there. And the same source is just repeated over and over again. But that's an interesting concept that may apply to Oak Island too, and the secrecy there, that there was later a gold rush in Nova Scotia during the 1860s. So there is natural gold there. That if people at earlier times had known about that, that could be the source of some of the secrecy and the purpose for the money pit and other concepts like that as well that time. And then we go on to where, if this was known of over a span of time, people could have added to the story or added their attributes to it in the way the money pit resembled the 9-layered vault and the story of the money pit in Sidney's book. So it's hard to pin down an exact time frame, that even though we're coming up with a lot of other information that does seem germane to the whole story, it's still frustrating because you still can't pin down exactly who done it.
Yeah.
Exactly. We know the McGinnis story was post 1795 for sure.
Right.
But yeah, where and when and how the retrofit was done is just an unknown.
He's also interesting too because Daniel McGinnis was originally from North Carolina,
He was.
according to a lot of sources. So here's another quote American colonist that was a loyalist that did come to Nova Scotia. And one of the most interesting things I found out about Daniel McGinnis was his possible relation to the Jacobite heroine Flora MacDonald. Flora MacDonald had helped Bonnie Prince Charlie escape from Scotland after the 1745 Jacobite Rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
And attached to that story are all these legends of, quote, Jacobite gold. Because the Vatican did donate what was said to be 400,000 livres a month towards the Jacobite rebellion that were then delivered by the French to Scotland to aid him in that. So when the rebellion failed, Flora MacDonald was charged with aiding him in his escape, getting him to a ship where he could go back to France. And also at that time, a man named John McGinnis was also punished for helping Bonnie Prince Charlie escape.
Interesting.
So later, subsequently, both the McGinnis family and Flora MacDonald ended up living in Anson County, North Carolina, which is named for Admiral Anson of Shugborough Hall, where the Shepherd's Monument is located.
Interesting.
And their families became intermarried there. So after the war, they both ended up in Nova Scotia, where she lived for about a year. And of course, the rest is history with Daniel McGinnis, Vaughan, and Smith discovering the money pit. So that's an awful strange association there, too, that involves a lot of missing gold.
Mm-hmm.
That's in turn, again, associated in England with the Anson family. Because through some marriages, when Flora MacDonald was in prison, she was aided by Lady Primrose, who kind of raised money for her and allowed her to spend time at her home even while she was, quote unquote, imprisoned. So that is very curious too, that the Primroses later become intermarried with the Anson family and some of the other families of the ship's captains that were associated with Admiral Anson, including his fleet was involved in the second siege of Louisbourg. So there's lots of avenues by which large amounts of gold from Jacobite sources or the siege of Louisbourg, for example, or other more mundane piracy or harassment of Spanish shipping and things like that could have been hidden on Oak Island that this circle of people would have been aware of.
And the pirate Peter Easton?
Well, he was a little bit earlier, and he's also in the circle of people who may have been knowledgeable about Philip Sidney and the works of Bacon and De Vere and all those mysteries surrounding the works of Shakespeare, because he was an Elizabethan sea captain who was tasked with guarding the Cupid's colony in Newfoundland.
Correct.
And this is starting about 1610. And we know Sir Francis Bacon had an interest in the Cupid's colony as well as the Virginia Company. But Peter Easton is really one of the only documented pirate stories that you'll see where they know that he got away with what was said to be 2 million English pounds worth of booty. And his story's interesting because he was valued under the monarchy of Queen Elizabeth, but when James I took over, he became a criminal and went to privateering. And that is when he was said to amass this large fortune, mostly by raiding Spanish shipping off of the coast of Africa. And he would return to Newfoundland to resupply and conscript more sailors. He had a fleet of 10 ships at one point, it was said.
Wow.
But what is really interesting about Easton is on his base on Oteron Island, there off the kind of south central coast of Newfoundland, there's another money pit legend there.
Really?
Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, please.
It's fascinating.
Right. Of course, the information is scant about that, but there are a couple of narratives that say people had discovered a pit where oaken boards had covered it, and they couldn't excavate it because it was near a swampy area, but they obviously could tell this pit had been man-made, similar to the description of the money pit. So given Easton's associations, he would have known a lot of the other ship's captains of Queen Elizabeth, like Bartholomew Gosnold and Captain Archer, who went to the Newport area in 1602, Captain John Smith, who's famous at Jamestown, and also Sir Francis Drake, and some of the other inner circle of people who had this appreciation for Philip Sidney and his work. So it's not out of the question that Peter Easton could have also been involved in the Oak Island story. He was in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
And
sure.
there is a totally separate legend that there was a money pit associated with him. So other compelling part of that story is that he is said to have kind of defected to the House of Savoy in Monaco, where he took this fortune that he had recovered. And he became a Marquis of Savoy, or the Marquis of Panclieri at that time, which is in the region of Saborga, Italy, which used to be the Principality of Saborga. And there's all these legends of the Knights Templar going to Saborga with the, quote, great secret that they had discovered in the Holy Land, that would be the original 9 Knights Templar. And there's a story like that in Saborga, that they brought something there that was composed of information that was a threat to the church and other interests like monarchies in Europe at that time. So it's interesting that he ended up in that region, and he just led a kind of a quiet life after that as the Marquis. But it's interesting that he's associated with the Savoy, where all the English monarchs banked from the Republic of Genoa. And in fact, the English flag even comes from the flag of the Republic of Genoa, that they actually paid tribute to Genoa to use at first. So the original English flag of the white field with the red cross comes to us from Genoa.
Interesting.
So it's interesting that
Yeah.
Easton later got involved in that kind of circle of people in the early 1600s, a little later in history. But with the money people, I mean, they're even involved with the symbology of the city of London, of St. George and the dragon, that a lot of people, of course, associate with the Knights Templar. But if you really look into it, that the more direct association is with the imagery and iconography of the Republic of Genoa.
Interesting.
Yeah, Judy Rudabish is asking this question here. It just says Facebook user, but that's who it is. Judy asking about, what's your opinion on Xenas Map? Have you studied that at all?
Hi, Judy, first of all. I know Judy. Yeah, I do have a problem believing the Cremona document is an authentic document from the medieval times. Now, with that said, I still think it has a lot of valuable information. I probably would go for Francis Bannerman being the actual creator of that, because he had the background as an arms and relic dealer. I mean, this man had a very extensive collection of weaponry, medieval armor, and he was fascinated with all of that history of the Knights Templar. And he also came from a strong Jacobite background that I referred to possibly Daniel McGuinness and Flora MacDonald having just a little later in the 19th century, when those sentiments were still well and alive during that time period. So he had built his Scottish castle on the Hudson River that many of you may have heard of as part of the Cremona document story. And interestingly, the castle is exactly due west of the Newport Tower.
Really?
So in all of these structures, these octagonal structures that we're talking about, that I believe were inspired from Sidney's book as well, the mention of the 2 star-shaped lodges connected by the tail of a comet in the book, that the Newport Tower is actually associated with that and not any earlier versions of history as many people suppose. Now, those things are possible, but from what I've found, it seems to have been built later. So I think Francis Bannerman intentionally built his castle on the Hudson at exactly 270 degrees due west from the Newport Tower. Now, if we look at Xena's map, that was a later edition that she found in the back of a book, if I understand correctly.
Correct.
Right underneath the back lip or something like that. Yeah.
Right. So due to legal reasons, they can't show the original Cremona document maps on the show, from what I understand.
Yeah, that I'm not sure about, but yep.
That's
So
correct.
interestingly, Oak Island is included on the map from the original, quote, Cremona document, and it has a longitude marked of 66 degrees and 6 minutes in Roman numerals. Now, many people assume that that uses a prime meridian or 0 point, because all of longitude coordinates have a 0 point, like Greenwich, England today is the 0 point that we all refer to.
Right.
But most maps from that era refer to the Paris meridian as the 0 point. So I did the math and calculated the arc minutes and everything using the coordinate from Oak Island, and it led to a meridian that had been created by the Cassini family in the mid 1700s. So that meridian had not been defined before that. And the meridian also represented a dividing line between their very famous and very accurate map of France that the Cassini family of astronomers had produced and finished by the late 1700s. So that meridian was also used by them in experiments to calculate the exact size and shape of the Earth. So being that meridian had not been created before, and that is what the coordinates on Oak Island in the Cremona document map are referencing, indicates that at least the map portion of that was referencing a much later system of longitude and latitude that, when found, people in the know would realize that the Cassini family had created that. And the Cassinis are also very interesting. The Cassini space probe was named for them. They're very famous.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, the astronomers and cartographers. And Cassini I, the elder Cassini, was even the astrologer for the French king for a while, because back in those days, in the late 17th century, astronomer and astrologer was kind of a crossover in disciplines, that he fulfilled that too. So it's also interesting that Cassini I, was also from the Principality of Seborga, and he was a knight of Malta. He was born in Parinaldo, what is Parinaldo, Italy today, that is only about 2 kilometers from the town of Seborga, and was included in the boundaries of the Principality of Seborga back in the days of the Knights Templar. So those kind of connections are very interesting, that when you go through other stories, like the story of Rennes-le-Château, which also involves Arcadian imagery, that the Cassini name pops up a lot, because the Paris meridian itself that they legally defined for the first time as part of that story. So even there are interesting connections using geography, even between Rennes-le-Château and Shugborough Hall, that indicate that there's a common brain trust behind a series of stories that may be meant to kind of lead you on a quest, from place to place, where you learn these different histories at each point. And that does not mean that they would be so heartless not to leave something for you to find if there's a treasure involved, that they probably
Some tidbits,
Yeah.
that there would be something, real, tangible, that could be considered a treasure. But to me, a lot of the treasure is kind of what you learn as you go along, when you investigate the people involved, the people mentioned, the history of the places you're looking at, and Oak Island is no exception.
I got a question, Cort. Do you think Oak Island was, and this, I'm going back and forth with a fellow researcher, an initiation point, a point where people came to be initiated in some sort of secret society, place for refueling and ship repair? I mean, what was its function? Was it symbolic? Was it's pragmatic? Both? I'm always under the impression that was meant to be both symbolic
Yeah,
and then if you could relate that back to the whole kind of map and the money pit, that would be great.
right. Well, of course, all of those things are possible. Obviously, there could have been like careening ships or cleaning the hulls of ships going on there, recalking the hulls and activities like that. That also could relate to things being hidden there, or it being known as an out-of-the-way place where ships also had access to.
Sure.
So, as we discussed before, over time, the folklore aspect of it, or the initiatory aspect that you suggest, that people would notice how it resembled the 9-layered vaults of Enoch.
Correct. Yep.
Or another set of people would recognize that this resembled a story in Philip Sidney's book.
Correct.
That it would have meaning to them.
Correct.
So yeah, they could have prompted people. I feel the same way about the octagonal powder magazine in Williamsburg
exactly.
and the Newport Tower, that these are things that you're supposed to approach where there's a kind of a cover story given that kind of sucks you into really looking into it. And then you start to come up with the similarities between more ancient legends and the reality of the way people valued it at the time. The mythical version of it also developed. So these things can morph over time, but as in the other case, I do think it's still possible that something is at Oak Island, in the fact that things that they're recovering there even matches kind of this story in Philip Sidney's book with the parchments, and possibly even the human remains, because even the whole Arcadian theme is a memento mori.
Correct.
Or in part a remembrance of those who have passed before, such as in the famous Nicolas Poussin painting where they're all contemplating the tomb. And that comes straight from the poetry of Virgil, where Daphnis, the pastoral Arcadian poet, is the one who's in the tomb. So people have taken that in an interpretive way. In how I pointed out, Virgil was valued like Nostradamus and applied all kinds of different possibilities to who is in the tomb. So Oak Island in that way does have these funerary overtones, as does the story of the Powder magazine and colonial rebel Nathaniel Bacon in Williamsburg.
So can you talk to us about Nathaniel Bacon's connection? And you got to go there. Sure. That'd be great.
Well, the whole, I guess, mania over the, quote, Bruton Vault or Bacon's Vault in colonial Williamsburg came from Marie Bower Hall, the wife of the famous Masonic mystic Manly P. Hall. I'm sure a lot of people out there may be familiar with who he is. So through a series of investigations, she became convinced that Nathaniel Bacon, who was a distant cousin of Sir Francis Bacon, had come to Jamestown with a stash of Sir Francis Bacon's papers. So we all know how important that is, and all of the speculation with regarding to who actually penned the works of Shakespeare.
Right. Yep.
Who laid out the first folio, was Bacon involved? So that's a very popular story. But as I looked into that seemed kind of implausible. But what you do find is Nathaniel Bacon himself may be the center of what that story was supposed to mean. At one point, Miss Hall noticed that the tombstone of James Nicholson was laid out like a page in the first folio of Shakespeare. And James Nicholson was personal friends with Thomas Jefferson. Now, his date of death was 1773. So they reasoned that the number of feet from Wren Hall on the campus of William and Mary, which is part of this alignment along Duke of Gloucester Street, that is kind of like a new Jerusalem, or some people term a new Atlantis array of architecture. If you go 1,773 feet, it leads to where, quote, Bacon's Vault was supposed to be. And that would be under the bell tower of the original church that was there just a few yards from the church now that is there, that was later built in 1715. So she did a good job of figuring that part out. But from then on, my opinion kind of diverges, because one of the biggest mysteries in Virginia archaeology is, where are the remains of Nathaniel Bacon? They've never found his grave or place of burial, because during the revolt that he started, which really was successful and took over most of the colony, he unexpectedly passed away, and then the rebellion just fell apart and his remains were hidden somewhere. And this is where we get into kind of the Rosicrucian overtones of the whole story, because as we all know, one of the core tenets of Rosicrucian thought involves the missing remains of Christian Rosenkreuz being hidden in an unknown chamber with a treasure and a library. So I can see why Mrs. Hall would even make these assumptions if you're a studier of Bacon and all of the mysteries surrounding the first folio, that she would assume that. But I think the followers of Nathaniel Bacon secretly buried him in the churchyard. Because if his remains would have been found, they would have been disrespected, drawn, quartered, beheaded, possibly his head displayed on a pike, which even is supported later by the story of Blackbeard's head that was displayed on a pike in Hampton Harbor for a couple of years, and then was said to be taken down and fashioned into the base of a silver punch bowl. Yeah. Wow. And even though that story sounds outrageous,
there you go.
It sounds outrageous, like it's out of a movie or something, right? Yeah. But there's actual sources of people seeing that as late as the 1920s. So that is how Nathaniel Bacon would have been treated. And I think his followers wanted to avoid that, so secretly buried him in the Bruton Parish churchyard, which later, not until the 1930s, was kind of conflated into a vault of Sir Francis Bacon's papers being hidden there.
Oh.
So that whole story is interesting in that
it is.
The conflict of Bacon's rebellion was in 1676, just 100 years before the American Revolution. That this was a conflict between people who used to be indentured servants that didn't have any land against the landed gentry who controlled everything going on in the colony. So the Declaration of Nathaniel Bacon was later an inspiration for Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. This is one of his stated inspirations for that. So then it's interesting that he was close friends with James Nicholson, who was the steward of the College of William and Mary, and that I even found a source of Jefferson paying Nicholson an undisclosed amount of money a year before he passed.
Really?
So this whole entire mystery, including his tombstone that's laid out similar to a page in the first folio, it says "Dear Reader" and everything, and has a statement like that, and that Jefferson was privy to this, which was locally probably a cloistered secret that began being kept a secret from the followers of Nathaniel Bacon. So though that's a long story, we can see that how the connections it has and why it may have been kept a secret over time, and how President Jefferson was inspired by the Declaration of Nathaniel Bacon, and he may have been among some of the people who knew this secret, because he had been a student at William and Mary, where he studied things like astronomy and land surveying, where the powder magazine is. And that's one of these structures that's octagonal. It's very similar to the Newport Tower. In fact, one of the facets of the octagon of the Newport Tower creates an arc on the globe that, quote, points directly to the Newport Tower.
Oh, really?
So they may have even been aware of that then. Obviously, I believe they were, and that the powder magazine in Colonial Williamsburg was built to be an horlogion, or one of these structures that denote an axis mundi, that have all of these alchemical concepts and astronomical concepts associated. And that's one of the things I learned when I was looking into why Thomas Jefferson would build octagonal structures.
Right.
So he was initiated into the true purpose of these structures that kind of all go back to the Tower of the Winds of Athens, which many people speculate had a pressurized water clock in it that would allow even the Greeks to have fixed longitude at that time. So as we go on at Thomas Jefferson's estate Monticello in Poplar Forest, it's even a recorded part of history that he established prime meridians at both of his homes. So these are things that you use like an axis, where it may be used to indicate a direction to another point of mystery, or that later people may have used in other treasure stories, or stories like the story of Nathaniel Bacon, because the Powder magazine in Williamsburg also, quote, points to where Nathaniel's Bacon's grave is, or where Miss Hall thought Bacon's vault was located.
Wow.
And there was even, as John went looking recently, there used to be a stained glass rendering of Nathaniel Bacon in the Powder magazine.
But it's not there anymore, right? So we think it's where would you guys were talking about this the other day. Where do you think it is now?
Well, they moved it to, quote, what is known of as Bacon's Castle over on the south side of the James River, that Nathaniel Bacon captured and kind of used as a headquarters for a while during the rebellion. That he didn't even own it, but it came to be known of as Bacon's Castle later in history. And they have tours where you can go tour Bacon's Castle now and learn all about Bacon's rebellion. That's one of the biggest monuments to Bacon's rebellion that there is. So it's no surprise that they moved that there.
Yep. I know this is really interesting too, and we got Jake Roberts is actually in the group watching tonight, and welcome, Jake. Thank you for being here. And he's a researcher into all things Sir Francis Bacon, and so I'm going to have to ask him about that a little bit and see just what I had not known all these different stories about Nathaniel Bacon, so that's really interesting. Now you said earlier that how was he related again? He was the nephew.
He was a distant cousin of the real Sir Francis Bacon. And there was also, it's funny, there's another Nathaniel Bacon there that is his cousin that's older. And he was one of the landed gentry even that he was fighting against during Bacon's rebellion.
Right.
So it's interesting that later they found the elder Nathaniel Bacon's tombstone on the property he used to own. And they moved that into the bell tower room of the Bruton Parish Church today. So when you actually go in there today and look, you see the tombstone with the Bacon arms on it, and it says Nathaniel Bacon, and it's where one of the locations where Miss Hall thought Bacon's vault was located. So literally, there's a Bacon's vault or tombstone in the bell tower room of the Bruton Parish Church today that you'll see if you go there.
Mm-hmm. There's Jake popped in now, and he said it's really interesting story. Cort digs deep. Yes, he does.
I try.
He gets into where he finds the time to dig up all this research. I don't know, but I tell you what, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, and it all seems to be tying together. I mean, if you look at all these different angles, as you have shown us here or described here, they all tie together. It's not a coincidence. Absolutely not a coincidence.
I know, and it's crazy because at first you want to kind of fight the urge to say that, it's like you're that guy in the movie Conspiracy Theory with the map with the strings, all connecting it together. And you're like, this is just wacky that, the same names, the same themes keep being emphasized with the treasure. And a lot of them are linked to the political things that are going on during the era in which they happened, but also linked to real treasures too that were missing. So I can see why, from one point of view, to attach the story of a golden treasure to something that you want to make people learn goes again back to this Rosicrucian core belief of the treasure and the tomb. There's always a funerary aspect, a treasure, and then information in a form of a library or Gnostic documents or hidden lost documents and concepts are involved. Even going back to Seborga with the great secret of Seborga and the legend of the Knights Templar and what they may have known that was a threat and things like that.
Sure.
So there's some basis in truth to all that, but it's kind of a common way to get people looking into it too, to pique their interest and get them into it.
So what you're saying, Cort, is the real treasure might be some esoteric truth that the actual places are teaching, and the mythology is teaching. Correct?
That's entirely possible that could be the main reason for it. But as I said, it would have been really heartless for a real treasure in some cases not to be involved, because it just seems logical that could also be the reason that the other folklore was applied to a real treasure.
Correct.
So that somebody says, oh, there's a story about a missing treasure at Oak Island, so we can add all of these things to it, so people learn about Enoch and Freemasonry, or the story of Philip Sidney and his impact on the whole kind of later Baconian, milieu of mystery and intrigue associated with all of that. That draws people into it.
So one more question, Jeff, and
no, please,
real quick.
You're the co-host.
Yeah. Between the two, Oak Island or Williamsburg, if there's a place for an actual treasure, where would you lay your money? What would you bet?
Well, I think the treasure in Williamsburg was kind of allegorical in that we're just talking about the remains of Nathaniel Bacon with the kind of Rosicrucian overtone attached to that story. But I think if you look at the British Navy during the 18th century and all of the money they captured from France and Spain, we had the siege of Havana that a lot of people have speculated also could be part of the treasure, or even going back to Sir Francis Drake, who was a personal friend of Philip Sidney's as well. He's a good suspect for a real treasure to have been put there. And all of these people involved in those naval operations were associated with Admiral Anson of Shugborough Hall, which was part of his fleet. And we know that the whole layout of Shugborough Hall is an Arcadia. All of the architecture there is meant to invoke that. They have a reproduction of the Tower of the Winds of Athens there, which also may in fact refer to the structures in Sidney's book.
Same theme.
They have the Shepherd's Monument there with the Nicolas Poussin rendering.
It's the same
on
theme.
it that kind of leads you there. And that family, Admiral Anson gained his fortune first of all from capturing the Manila treasure galleon during his circumnavigation voyage. He's famous as being the third Englishman to circumnavigate. And so that made him very wealthy. And his brother was also independently wealthy, and he's actually the one who built the Shepherd's Monument due to being a major stockholder in the South Sea Company, who sold all of his stock early before it crashed. So he became fabulously wealthy from that as well, and that's what allowed them to kind of build their own personal Arcadia there at Shugborough Hall.
And what's really interesting, I think I read this in something you wrote, was Philip Sidney connected to John Dee?
Yes, many sources state he was a student of John Dee's.
That's what I thought.
That he's mentioned in his journal several times, as well as his sister, Mary Sidney Herbert, the Countess of Pembroke. And this is where we're getting into maybe the true authorship of the Shakespeare question, right?
Correct.
Because even before, slowly kind of came to the conclusion that what is known as the Wilton Writers' Circle of Mary Sidney Herbert, the Countess of Pembroke, was who was behind the works of Shakespeare. Philip Sidney had written his book Arcadia for his sister, and it became even known of later as the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia. So their associations are even interesting because, for instance, we know there's this kind of conspiracy theory that Sir Francis Bacon was actually the son of Queen Elizabeth and Sir Robert Dudley. If that were true, Philip Sidney and his sister would have been Bacon's first cousins, because Robert Dudley was their uncle. And then we see
that's what Jake was talking about.
That's Jake Roberts right there.
Yeah, exactly.
So then later we see Philip Sidney's nephews becoming very powerful courtiers of James I and Charles I and so on, that are the subjects of the dedication of the first folio of Shakespeare. We have William and Philip Herbert, Philip being named for his uncle Philip Sidney, being the dedicatees, which also infers, and other people espouse, that they actually funded the printing of the first folio, where we know that is where all the coded portions are present.
Correct.
Possibly due to the way the first folio is laid out. Now, even given that, Sir Francis Bacon still could have easily been a huge part of that. You know, all the theories about Bacon range from him being the true author of the plays of Shakespeare to him just being involved in the coded portion of the first folio. But recently, what I've been looking into is interesting, that another suspect, of course, to have produced the works of Shakespeare is the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere. And
I've heard that name before. Tell us about that.
Well, Philip Herbert, the nephew of Philip Sidney, was married to his daughter Susan. So earlier in history, Philip Sidney himself and Edward de Vere kind of had this antagonistic relationship that began with a fist fight they got into over a game of tennis, where they wanted to duel each other and everything, and the Queen had to stop them, from doing that. So some of the theories revolve around the fact that, of course, de Vere was the actual author of the Shakespeare plays, and that later Philip Herbert and his brother William had covered this up with a kind of conspiracy to tell you William Shakespeare had done it. Do not let it be known that Edward de Vere was the true author of said plays, which Edward de Vere may have even not wanted people to know, because he criticized nobles, and some of the plays had controversial aspects to them where he could have actually gotten in trouble for doing that. So there's a lot of inference, and there's still other suspects and other factors involved. But to me, it seems clear that the Herbert family were involved in all of that. They had all the right associations and connections, which then leads us now to Thomas Jefferson.
Yes, please.
Because if we look at the family of Philip Sidney, he married the daughter of the, quote, spy master of Queen Elizabeth, Sir Francis Walsingham. So Sidney was Walsingham's son-in-law. Walsingham's brother-in-law was a man named Thomas Randolph, who was a direct forebearer of Thomas Jefferson via his mother's Randolph family. So here we have, Thomas Randolph was also working in league with other intelligence assets like Dr. John Dee and a man named Robert Beale, who is part of the same Beale family of the famous treasure story in Virginia, that they were even the liaison between Mary, Queen of Scots, and Queen Elizabeth. So that's the kind of position they held in the diplomatic world of Elizabethan England. That Thomas Jefferson, now this supplies us with it, not a blood relation to Philip Sidney, but a family relation. So as I looked into this even more, I found out that Jefferson's other forebearer, William Randolph III, in Virginia, had named his home Wilton House, just west of Williamsburg. And Wilton House is where Sir Philip Sidney wrote the book Arcadia.
Interesting.
So this is even interesting because the Randolph family was known to own a, quote, copy of the false folio of Shakespeare.
False folio. Now I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, what's the false folio?
It was an earlier printing that included many of the plays, but not all of them, and then a few other plays that were later determined not to have been part of the canon of Shakespeare. So it was known as the false folio. So even later in Randolph family history, in the 19th century, we see family members being named Philip Sidney Randolph and Algernon Sidney Randolph. And here we're led again to the imagery of the Declaration of Independence, because Algernon Sidney, his writing ended up getting him beheaded by Charles II. He lived in the late 1600s, latter 1600s. So some of his writing was a said inspiration for Thomas Jefferson in his painting of the Declaration of Independence. So we know now that Thomas Jefferson was fully aware of everything I've just told you. Yep. His family valued it. They were intimately involved, even through, at the time of Elizabethan England, or just after the time of Elizabeth, there was another Thomas Randolph that he was actually directly related to, that was a poet. And he was part of the circle of Ben Jonson, who wrote the dedication of the first folio dedicated to Philip Sidney's nephews. So he was in that circle so much that the circle of poets was known as the tribe of Ben. And so Thomas Randolph, Jefferson's forebear, was a member of that, and he was part of this set of people who may have been aware of all of these secrets we've been discussing, with kind of an esoteric value of the works of Philip Sidney, and the works of Shakespeare, and the book Arcadia as well. So there's ample evidence that Thomas Jefferson knew of all of this. And this kind of speaks to earlier what we were talking about via American influence in the Oak Island story. So here we have a huge value of the concept of Arcadia and Philip Sidney in English royalty. And here we have one of their nemesis, Thomas Jefferson, also being intimately aware of how that concept is valued and all the details of it. And we know Jefferson was a huge fan of Sir Francis Bacon. Two actual Bacon family members worked for him at Monticello, managing his estate. Later, just a little later, after he was president, a man named William Burwell was his personal secretary, and the Burwell family in part are descendant of the sister of the elder Nathaniel Bacon I described earlier. So he even surrounded himself with Bacon family members from that had their heritage in colonial Virginia and were somewhat related to Sir Francis Bacon as cousins.
Wow.
So Jefferson had a portrait of Sir Francis Bacon. He had an extensive art collection that kind of exposes some of his esoteric values, including a portrait of Mary Magdalene and other concepts he may have picked up in France. So I used to think maybe Jefferson had learned all this when he went to France later in his career. But as I looked more into his family, I was just freaked out to find out he was actually related to Sidney.
Yeah, that is.
And that his family had an obvious trail of influence and appreciation of this. So, for instance, if Thomas Jefferson had heard the story of the money pit, he would have right away known to associate it with the story in Sidney's book. So that could lead to an American source for the whole Oak Island story, back to that theme we started with originally. Took a while to get back around to that.
No, but it's absolutely all related.
There's no doubt. Wait to put it in context to make that make sense. So, during the Revolution, and
you guys shared or sent me some pictures here before we got started, and before we jump away or get away from this Arcadia thing. I wanted to, and when I look at these pictures, I'm going to pop it up here in just a second. The first thing when I see something like this, I think about Jake Roberts, because Jake he looks at these kind of things. He goes, "Oh, he just sees all these symbols and everything." And it's this one here. Well, obviously I showed a couple different pictures of this, of this, particular writings by Sir Philip Sidney. Why the different? What's this one all about? What's that?
Well, that's a later flyleaf to an edition of the book Arcadia by Philip Sidney, and it does show all of these kind of Greek or Roman mythological characters, geometria. I can't read them right now because the picture's so small on my screen. I know.
Sorry about that.
But I can see why Jake would see a lot of hidden meaning and things like this, and really there's a lot of meaning just in what you see as well. So don't neglect to look at that either. that this kind of like tips you off to the mind frame. And as John had pointed out, even the liberal arts are referred to in these characters.
Correct.
So a lot of practical information is always included in a lot of these things, as well as the alchemical, Rosicrucian, and hidden things. There's a lot of practical science. And we know in part this tradition of hiding things in artwork like this, and other things also included practical science that may have been considered heretical at one point. So they would develop codes and symbols
Correct.
that helped people identify things like that, as well as more deeper coded meanings that John and Jake are interested in.
Yeah, and that's what fascinates me. And they have that kind of mind where they look at this and go, "Oh, look at this right here, and that means this and this." And I'm just like, "What? Wait a minute."
Right. I'm more adept. I'm into art history and the thematic meanings of artwork and that kind of line of it. I'm not a code breaker or anything like that. I would refer to either one of those guys if I wanted to crack a code that I thought was there, that are popular, but sometimes you can figure out the same thing from looking at the context of the artwork and the thematic meanings of it.
Correct.
Like that's one experience I had with the Shepherd's Monument, looking at that as opposed to most people looking at the coded portion. And I still came to the conclusion that was actually referring to Philip Sidney's Arcadia, and not necessarily all of the mysteries involving Nicolas Poussin. That they just used that picture to illustrate that concept in that instance.
Now, the Shepherds of Arcadia, can you talk to me or talk to us, Cort, about the location of that currently and how that kind of factors into some of the things that we've discussed?
Sure.
It's interesting. It's fascinating.
This is kind of freaky.
Well.
Because of course, we know Nicolas Poussin created that painting. I'm not sure of the exact date, but he did it under a commission from Cardinal Ropigliosi of the Vatican. He painted the Shepherds of Arcadia for him. And Ropigliosi was a member of an artist guild associated with the Vatican that came to be known as the Academy of Arcadia. That they also had a strong value of the Arcadian theme, and they even had outdoor meeting places like in the sacred groves of Greece and things like that were festooned with memento mori of artists and church figures that they valued before, that they would all take the time to contemplate what these people had accomplished during their life and that sort of thing. So we know later Louis XIV came into possession of the painting, and it was at Versailles, and that eventually, after the French Revolution, the painting came to be displayed at the Louvre Museum. And the Louvre was actually the original palace of French royalty, the first one that is much older than Versailles. That then became the National Museum of France, where all the artwork therein was owned by the French people. And so it's interesting that the painting is actually displayed on the Paris Meridian, where it crosses the museum. Like the actual spot where you go see the painting, you'll be standing very close to the Paris Meridian itself.
Wow. I didn't know
that's
that.
of interest in that painting is also associated with the story of Rennes-le-Château, which is situated along the Paris Meridian to the south.
Oh, wow.
So this speaks to one of the ways people use this imagery as a clue to tell you there's something more afoot.
Right.
But what I found back when I started looking into all of this from a geography perspective, then these buildings were meant to represent axes or, quote, point directions on the globe. I plotted the direction the Louvre Museum pointed to. And it points directly to Oak Island, Nova Scotia.
Really?
Yeah.
Yes. So here we have the painting, Shepherds of Arcadia, there with the actual geographic orientation of the building and the two more modern pyramids in the courtyard of the Louvre that point to Oak Island, Nova Scotia.
Wow.
And to me, this was really interesting because if you go to the closing scene of the movie The Da Vinci Code, they're showing you this.
Oh, really?
Compass bearing when he goes to the top of the inverted pyramid.
Yeah.
And he believes Mary Magdalene is entombed beneath that. They actually show you a brass marker, an Arago brass marker, and those actually mark the Paris meridian. And in reality, there isn't one on top of the inverted pyramid. But the angle they show you with regard to true north on that is the angle that points to Oak Island.
Oh, wow.
So that is
now that's right up the alley of of Corey and Mole and Christopher Morford, because that's exactly the kind of stuff they get into. Oh, my goodness.
It's fascinating. It's that same Arcadian theme, and then the painting becomes not necessarily teaching something. It's now twofold, and it's also a marker,
right?
Based on its location, which is fascinating.
That's all included in my book, Oak Island and the Arcadian Mysteries, that I published about 4 years ago now. That alignment is discussed in there. And interestingly, if you go to the opposite direction on the globe, the exact opposite way it points to the west or east, it goes to Migdal, Israel, which is the birthplace of Mary Magdalene.
Oh,
so at least in the movie, that it did involve Mary Magdalene, but it's interesting that later the concept of Arcadia via the story of Philip Sidney, I feel, becomes associated with Oak Island, and that the painting and the museum, quote, points to Oak Island.
Unbelievable.
Wow. Too many coincidences there. Again, as I mentioned before, that's just wow. And that's the kind of thing that, I love having you on the show and explaining this kind of thing to us, because it goes far beyond anything I could have ever imagined. It really does. And how you remember this? He doesn't have any notes, John. He's like,
I'm sitting here with my.
Well, you can imagine, like, the first time I read the story in the book Arcadia that resembles the money pit. I had been, word searching to death the theme of Arcadia, and I kept seeing Philip Sidney's Arcadia mentioned in the hits I would get. So I finally decided to search through the book using search terms to see if it had any correlations. And sure as heck, while I was searching the word vault, I come across the part of the book and I read this. It was like I was in an Alfred Hitchcock movie or something, where the background's moving behind you. And I just couldn't believe it, that this story resembles the story so closely. And it's in a book named Arcadia that, incidentally, I left out before. The Baron of Nova Scotia later amended the book with a new chapter.
Yes. Tell us about that real quick.
Right. So, of course, the Baron of Nova Scotia was in this circle of people who would have all been aware of this. He was a courtier of James I and Charles I and so on, and had been given the colony in Nova Scotia and everything. So in about 1613, there was kind of a hole in the story of Arcadia as it's told in the book. So he took it upon himself to write a new chapter that would kind of tie it all together better. And this is indeed included in all the versions of the book, including the one I own today. So the fact that he added a chapter that kind of alluded to the heritage of the Herbert family and mentions a Black Knight that does combat with the heroes in the book, that there was a Black Knight in the Herbert family from Wales earlier in history. So he was kind of paying homage to the Countess of Pembroke, I believe, just like Philip Sidney did in writing the book for his sister in the first place. So really, that's just does infer that he too obviously could have been in on knowing what the money pit was, or having constructed it, as like James McQuiston supposes, another Oak Island researcher, that could possibly tie into what he's found. And he's definitely could be one of the subjects that valued that book and would have known about the treasure story in that and how the money pit was described in Sidney's book. So as time goes on, there are some things that indicate maybe it wasn't him, but definitely that's a solid view of things. I would say that that possibility is there.
Right. And it's yeah, that's in it, and we have I know, also I don't know if she's still here, but Alessandra Nadavari was also in the chat here a little bit ago. And that's some of the stuff that I know she's very familiar with too. One of those, we did have a couple of questions from some of the folks that posted a few questions prior to, and this is going to kind of pull us back here a little bit. One of the things, and we kind of talked to Sharon had asked a question about, she was looking forward to seeing you on tonight and very interested in the colonial connection to Oak Island. We've kind of talked about that a little bit already tonight, but here's another one that I thought was really interesting was, and this was from Teresa. She said, ask them about the layout of Washington, D.C. And, I find it fascinating, and I've seen a few shows and stuff talking about it. What's your take on the layout of Washington, D.C.?
Well, if I knew that for sure, that would be something. But no, obviously there are things, hidden in there, kind of in the tradition of the geography I was referring to before, that even the National Mall is kind of a representation of the fora or forums of Rome. And even really the original layout of Williamsburg may have been an inspiration in that part.
Oh, really? You think so?
Washington, D.C., because it's a linear array with all of the monuments and important government buildings, the colonial capitol at one end and the Wren Hall at the campus of William and Mary on the other end. That could have helped to inspire that. So we know Pierre L'Enfant originally designed the street plan, and Andrew Ellicott assisted him and kind of took over later after L'Enfant withdrew. So being from this set of French people who helped us in the revolution, that L'Enfant was part of an esoteric tradition where he just had an open, empty slate to create another Versailles or another Arcadian wonderland that many wealthy people had referenced in their building of their estates in Europe and England prior to that. So he's an interesting character who was also a member of the Society of the Cincinnati that I mentioned before. And beyond that, he designed all the medals, commemorative coins, and swords and certificates for the society. So his influence goes beyond just the streets of Washington, D.C. and all of the mysteries there, which I suppose a lot of people, obsess about the star in the streets of Washington, D.C. Right. Now, really, the star it is right on what's known as the White House meridian, that Thomas Jefferson had also a hand in planning this array of monuments on the same longitude as the White House. So that star, I believe, the star is also a reference to Arcadia. It's one of the symbols of Arcadia, because if we go back into Greek mythology, the mythological character Arcas is the namesake of Arcadia. Now, in Greek mythology, Arcas and his mother were cast into the sky as Ursa Major for his mother, Callisto. Okay. And Arcas was Ursa Minor. And the tale of Ursa Minor includes the pole star. So, or the Stella Maris, other people refer to it as the Star of Mary. So this introduces kind of this geographic concept into what Arcadia could mean secretly to other people, that they had ways to lay out and define their domain and map it that wasn't understood by the common man at that time, that it was kind of a cloistered secret that where the king could understand how big his country was or where cities were located in relation to each other and things like that. So that part of Washington, D.C. then even has a really interesting link to the lost colony of Roanoke, the Roanoke colony.
Roanoke, that's what, I was going to ask you about that.
Right, because as we know, that was situated on an island not far from the Outer Banks in North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
But after a while, a map known as the Virginia Pars Map, that was likely created by Thomas Harriot, who was an associate of Dr. John Dee's. He actually was at the colony for about a year, and he was likely who actually created this map. That about 80 miles to the west of the lost colony, there was a star-shaped fort drawn onto the map that was then blotted out.
Really?
They found this via x-raying the map and studying it with modern technology.
Mm-hmm.
And so this star-shaped fort was situated on what is known as the sacred longitude, the 77th degree west of longitude from Greenwich. That is said to have been valued by Dr. D as a longitude where the equinoxes could be accurately measured better than at other longitudes. So that's interesting that they may have intended to originally put the colony where the fort was drawn on the map on the quote sacred longitude, that even indeed here recently archaeologists from Williamsburg even have identified a site there that's the correct age that may mean some of the lost colonists did actually move to that area.
Wow.
Where the quote sacred longitude is located. So now let's cut to after the American Revolution, where Thomas Jefferson is deciding where the nation's capital will be. So the White House meridian matches the sacred longitude even to the point that it's close to where the star-shaped fort is located on the Virginia Pars map that had been created as part of the lost colony. So we may even see this value. We know from what I've described before, Thomas Jefferson's fetish for prime meridians and geography and hiding things, kind of like you can hide things using an axis, even like a pirate's map. It's at an angle from here, a certain distance, and that's where you should go look. And there may be clues that let you know those kind of things. So it's really interesting that the whole city is situated on what may be considered the sacred longitude or sacred meridian that was said to be valued by John Dee, who designated it as such. And even Jamestown is very close to that. If it would have been just a little further to the west, it would have been included on the 77th degree of longitude. So later, President Jefferson was also the one who had the capital moved from Williamsburg to Richmond, Virginia. And that's included on the same degree of longitude as Washington, D.C. Wow. So there's two instances of Jefferson kind of having this esoteric knowledge and may have having sources or through his education at William and Mary that goes back to the earlier Elizabethan days and his relatives that he had, including Thomas Randolph, Philip Sidney, and the Thomas Randolph, the poet, as well.
Wow.
It's fascinating how that all ties together. Go ahead, John.
Oh, I was going to say, we have something from a Facebook user about Verrazano calling North Carolina Arcadia, which I was unaware of. We know that Verrazano was in the New World, and he writes about it in a written record of the voyage of 1524. Can you talk to us a little bit about Verrazano?
That's Wayne Murphy brought that up.
Wayne Murphy.
No, that is included in you know. Verrazano's map isn't the most accurate thing in the world compared to modern standards, right? So one of the more popular schools of thought is that what he designated Arcadia did begin in North Carolina, just about where the lost colony was later located as well. And this went up and included the eastern part of Virginia and the whole eastern seaboard up to Nova Scotia and beyond in the part that he designated La Arcadia. So that's the original source of even later it becoming known as French Acadia, because Acadia is kind of a French slang that means Arcadia as well. So Verrazano was at least responsible for naming that. And it's also interesting his trip there to the Newport Harbor and being there and not noting a tower was there is one of the reasons I believe it was built later.
Yeah.
And his influence on all of this was central to a lot of what happened later in French history and the back and forth with England in Nova Scotia and parts of Maine as well.
Was there any documentation of him being in Nova Scotia?
No, not to my knowledge, but
Okay.
you can see there on the map even that he
He's
traveled
real
close
close.
enough to have possibly stopped there and not been
Okay.
part of the ship's logs.
Yeah.
Or some occurrence like that. I mean, that's one of the frustrating things about looking into a lot of this is the record keeping back in the Renaissance and medieval times and later isn't as always detailed. Things were lost. Sometimes things may have been intentionally hidden.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
Correct.
Queen Elizabeth hid away Sir Francis Drake's logs from his circumnavigation.
Wow.
Issues like that, that they could be hidden somewhere still today.
Mm-hmm.
And that could speak to kind of one of the quote treasures we're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So in this series of American stories like the Bruton Vault, the Beale treasure, and the story at Avenel House, I've identified the Declaration of Independence always comes up.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's an American treasure, in an allegorical way. That's something you learn about when you look into those things. So it's entirely possible a lot of these older stories do involve hidden documents, information that's important. That is, again, back to the Rosicrucian philosophy of a hidden tomb with an important person, a treasure, and important information.
And you're also talking about, Masonic influences with the founding fathers sitting there, and the Masonic Constitution of 1723, which strikingly resembles our own Constitution, with a clause of separation of church and state, so there would be no Vatican influence as much as religious freedom. I think that statement in the Constitution was twofold. They wanted to make sure that this Masonic colony, so to speak, would not have any church influence officially.
Sure, and that would
makes
also
sense.
speak to the reasons like whatever was left in a kind of national treasure way, like in the movies, would be important to the American ideal. An American treasure that would separate us from the old country and have our own mythology and our own legends and values that are exposed through these things. Just like there was a royal value of Philip Sidney's book, so they used that in a symbolic way several different times to present that. So in America, they planned it to use what America is and what our values are to be part of what you learned. Mm-hmm. In my opinion.
Yeah,
exactly. And what's interesting about what you said, when you look at, and I've done this, when you look at Rome, the Vatican City, and you look at Washington, D.C., the capital is very reminiscent of St. Peter's, obelisk, 7 cities, 7 hills in Rome, 7 hills in D.C., the Masonic layout. It's almost, and Library of Congress, and you had the Vatican archives. It's very similar in structure to Vatican City, but it's Masonic or has a Masonic basis. Right. So to me, that's fascinating.
Right, and the capital to me also resembles St. Paul's in London. That's interesting as well for another inspiration of maybe what they were referring to. Mm-hmm. But you're totally correct. It's kind of a tradition that some of these real treasures have these overlays of information that lead you to assumptions, just like what you were talking about. That there's design similarities and everything lead to your version of that kind of quest, Holy Grail, an American Holy Grail, mm-hmm. as opposed to the French version of it or the Vatican version of it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or the Knights Templar version, even. Lots of other examples of that. Like, every country's proud of their own heritage. There's mysteries like this in Scotland, in Wales, in Ireland, the cyclic cross of Vendée in France. I could go on with a couple of different, places that are important and have been pointed out where a kind of a legend leads people to be curious about it, and often a treasure is part of that.
Excellent.
We're about, we got about, I like to try to keep these to about 2 hours, and we're about an hour and 36 minutes in so far. And I know that, we could go on talking about the East Coast and the relationship between what we think Oak Island and as, let's see, who was it? Susan brought up here, Nova Scotia was almost the 13th colony. We kind of talked about that a little bit. But with the time remaining, I want to go a little bit west.
Okay.
And I know we can keep going with this, and maybe we should. And I tell you, you had brought up something out west where you're at, and it really fascinates me. And sorry for the diversion, folks, but there's so much information that Cort has amassed in his research of things that I find so terribly interesting. Tom said, "Go west, young man."
That's what America did.
Exactly. We all went west, right? So you had brought up that we got some symbols that you've shared with us, and I'll show those on the screen here in a minute. But the symbols near Mount Shasta. Now you have some really neat videos that you've done talking about Mount Shasta and stuff and writings. Tell us a little bit about these symbols and Mount Shasta. How does that? Tell us about that.
Sure. Well, in my studies of Mount Shasta, I became interested in that too. That because of all the interesting folklore stories of or kind of new age views of the city of Telos being located inside Mount Shasta.
Yeah.
The legend of J.C. Brown. That's another vault legend that's from the 1930s. That's similar to Oak Island or the Beale treasure. But as part of that, I discovered that there was this panel of strange glyphs that didn't appear to be Native American, that many people were relating to stories of Lemurians living inside Mount Shasta. So in studying that, I found a lot of other information, including the picture you're showing now that was included in an archaeological report for California, I think back in the 1940s, that related that these were probably from settlers. They speculate about a secret society or some organization being involved. And as I looked at the overall map in the places in the West where these are located, there was a huge correlation, not with all of them, but with many of them in the places that John Fremont had been, the famous explorer in California and the West overall, that these seem to pop up in places where he had been. And this just kind of led me to speculate via some of the things I learned that these were kind of a coded way where he would mark where resources were that could be exploited later. Mineral deposits, water, timber, and things like that, because the whole history of the early West does involve a group of explorers, including Edward Beale, who I feel is involved with the Beale treasure, Kit Carson, John Fremont, and others, where some of the stories that they're associated with are places where these symbols are present.
Right.
Now, I know other people, I forget the gentleman's name who wrote the book about Jesse James you had on recently.
Oh, Warren Gettler.
Yeah, I'm not saying they're wrong. They could also have been used later for things like that, or similar symbols for their own purposes, which the Knights of the Golden Circle does have connections to using octagonal templates to hide things, just like I suggest the Powder Magazine is and the Newport Tower is too, that they knew of this concept, and even Poplar Forest of Thomas Jefferson may be used in the Beale treasure story for a similar reason. So I'm not saying that they're wrong, but I think also in addition to that, this could have just been a secret way to denote resources that were being identified as they were exploring. Because why else would they explore? That's part of the reason for what they're doing, that they would mark this, and these symbols in a way would tell what was there or what was nearby, or if it was a little distance away, maybe even how far, what direction it was in.
Right.
So through my studies of Mount Shasta, it was interesting. I discovered another character named Joaquin Miller, who was an early author of California. He's very popular in literature of California and known for being an early California resident, and even of Mount Shasta. He lived near where these symbols were present. So as time went on, he wrote this book called My Life Amongst the Modocs, which became actually more popular in England than the United States. So he actually toured Europe promoting his book and selling his book. And when he came back, he lived in Washington, D.C., and built a cabin right on the White House meridian, which I thought was interesting.
Mm-hmm. It
So
is.
eventually he moves back to Oakland, and the property he bought was actually the property from which John Fremont first observed the Golden Gate in the San Francisco Bay Area in Oakland. Right. And lo and behold, his property included 2 panels of these glyphs. And he was interesting too. I think he knew what the White House meridian was, because he actually built a pyramid on his property that's exactly due south of the peak of Mount Shasta.
Really?
So here he'd even written a book in literature and poetry about Mount Shasta, and then later built this pyramid. And another interesting aside story is that Joaquin was part of the Bohemian Club of the Bay Area. And in his will, he insisted that his Bohemian Club brothers burn him on a funeral pyre, which he had already built out of stone on his property. So his wife put the kibosh on that. And as the story goes, his Masonic and Bohemian Club brothers dug him up and actually burned him.
They actually did do it. Huh?
Yeah, on the funeral pyre. So kind of macabre story there, but also has a tenuous tie into these strange petroglyphs of the West.
Now, did you find these on rocks, or did you find them on? Were they on trees? Or what were they?
They're on rocks.
Okay.
All the ones that I'm speaking of are inscribed on stones.
Wow.
That are drawing and use that same series of symbols. And really, what's kind of interesting is later I learned that Hmong tribesmen from Vietnam claim they can interpret these symbols.
Really?
Yes, like after Vietnam, a lot of Hmong people came to California and other places, and they would see these, and even to the point where they interpreted a few of them to say that treasure was nearby.
Interesting.
And so that was curious to me. There's a video on YouTube that shows you that theory and documents how that came about with the Hmong person that interpreted them. But it's possible that also these symbols have a Catholic origin to them, that the church had used a similar system before. And we know in that part of Vietnam, there were Jesuit missionaries, right, and other missionaries, even up until the time of the Vietnam War, where they may have learned of this, even going all the way back to the story of Prester John, who traveled somewhere to the east, and there's all kinds of legends and myths about him as well. So it's really kind of interesting that they may have, some Hmong people may have been schooled in how to interpret these via an association with the church. So that's interesting too. In the going back to the KGC again, that they could have definitely possibly used the same thing. In fact, I recently found out that during the Civil War, that Chico, where I lived, was one of the biggest concentrations of KGC in California at that time. Really? And I'm just starting to learn more about that now, because even the founder of the town, John Bidwell, was a Union side. He was a congressman during the Civil War.
Right. Yeah. They brought him up. His name was brought up during that evening.
And prior to that, this is funny because this is even an episode of the old TV show Death Valley Days. It's called The Woman with the Blue Silk Umbrella. That John Bidwell was one of the people who brought the charter for statehood back to California on a ship.
Really?
And that there were Confederate agents on the ship trying to steal the charter. So they hid it in one of the young ladies' blue silk umbrella so they wouldn't be able to find it.
Wow.
But the scan information I've got so far is that John Bidwell opposed the South, obviously, because he was part of the Union Congress during the Civil War, that he did a lot of secret things and had his own organization that opposed them during that time. So I'm still working on that one.
Wow.
And this is also interesting too. I'll squeeze this in here too. One of the first things I looked into was the strange street plan of Chico, which is a diamond-shaped 8x8 block plan.
Really?
And as I studied more, there's been interesting architecture added to this over the years. And John Bidwell's wife, Annie Bidwell, her full real name is Annie Ellicott Kennedy. She was actually related to Andrew Ellicott, one of the planners of Washington, D.C. So over the time I lived here, before I became interested in all this, periodically I would hear things about the strange street plan of Washington, D.C. There's kind of an old Bank of America building here built in the 1920s that is kind of a Roslyn Chapel or Solomon's Temple. It has all this esoteric stonework on it, like a phoenix rising from a grail cup.
Right.
Illustrations of Tubal Cain and Pallas Athena that has Masonic overtones. So all this stuff is lined up. So I think John Bidwell designed the whole town like a miniature of Washington, D.C.
Interesting.
Because the original plan of Washington, D.C. was a 10-mile square diamond.
Correct.
And so the original plan of Chico is this 8x8 block square that's kind of like a chessboard. And then the city plaza we have aligns with the Bidwell Mansion. It actually points to the Bidwell Mansion, and that's in the Queen Square of the plan of the town. And even at the city plaza today, there's chessboards, tables they have there with chessboards inlaid on them with the Masonic pillars of Boaz and Yakin to enter the area where the chessboard is. And the Bank of America is on the alignment between the city plaza and Bidwell Mansion. So all of this was an intentional nod to the plan of Washington, D.C., because his wife, Annie, was from there. He met her when he was a congressman. So I think he did that for her. And it's interesting, some of the streets like Cherry, Hazel, Ivy, Chestnut, and Orange spell Chico.
Oh, really?
And they're all in a row.
Interesting.
And so there's all these little things about the plan of Chico, how the city hall aligns with the city plaza, kind of like a miniature of the alignments in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
So that's kind of cool.
It is very like on the East Coast and the West Coast lining it up. Yeah.
Right. What's interesting, Cort, is you said there's chessboards and all. I recently went to the George Washington Masonic Temple in Arlington, Virginia, and they have a room that's checkerboarded just like that. And I asked about it, and they said, well, it really represents man's capacity for both good and evil. And in the Masonic tradition, it's the capacity that you can do good, you can do evil. But for the Masonic tradition, it's more of the freedom to do, and make those choices, which is exactly what the Constitution, basically entombs is our freedoms.
Right. It's like a yin and yang kind of concept.
Right. Yeah. So I'm not surprised that that's one of the symbols within that schematic.
Incidentally, too, that, chess obviously was said to be the favorite game of the Knights Templar, or during the Crusader era, it became very popular.
Really?
And there's that link to it as well, because it is kind of a medieval combat game you're playing there.
Yeah, true. Hey, Cort, you had said something about John Fremont's relation to a Beale. I have Edward. Is that accurate?
Right. He's not related to him, but they knew each other.
There's a relation there. Yeah.
That it's interesting because today here in Chico, just 18 miles north of town in Vina, California, is the monastery of New Clairvaux. And they've actually rebuilt a 13th century chapter house that was brought stone by stone from Spain. A Cistercian chapter house. So that's in Vina, California, which was the ranch one time of Peter Lassen, a famous pioneer of California, who was also friends with John Fremont and Senator Benton. So I just thought I'd throw that in there real quick. But Edward Beale is my main suspect in the Beale treasure story. And he was even traveled to the parts of Colorado where the treasure was supposedly discovered, but he did all kind of this search for resources and things like that. He shared with his friend John Fremont, and John Fremont's father-in-law, Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri. So that kind of speaks to the way politics works today too, where they're encountering all this wilderness with these resources in it, and they're all benefiting from it themselves and their family and associates. So that a long-time friendship between John Fremont and Edward F. Beale is very interesting, because Beale was a character very much like John Fremont. He explored the West a lot. He created the Beale Wagon Road that later became Route 66.
Oh.
Yeah, he blazed
I didn't know that.
a railroad grade right through the part of Colorado where the Beale treasure was supposed to have been found. And his daughter later ended up owning the Cripple Creek mine right in that area, which is one of the richest gold mines in Colorado history. And her McLean family became so wealthy that she actually owned the Hope Diamond. And she was the one who donated it to the Smithsonian Institute.
Wow.
So she was the last actual owner of the Hope Diamond. So there's that and a lot more that connect even Beale, Edward F. Beale, who is related to the Thomas Beale from the Bruton Vault story in Williamsburg. That's where his family originated. So he has a long string of these kind of mysteries in his family tradition as well, that where he would have been one of these later people during the mid to late 1800s that would have been privy to all of these kind of stories.
Sure.
And he may have even been involved in leaving some of the strange symbols along the way. So he may have been even privy to what those really meant. And he was an interesting character. He was on the Union side during the Civil War, at which time he became the Surveyor General of California. And he and his family developed Bakersfield, and the Beale Clock Tower and the Beale Library is there. And he also owned this huge, like 40,000 acre ranch known as the Tejon Ranch that's still there today, along with other investments in San Francisco and places like that. So it's really interesting how this spins around back to the Bruton Vault and Beale treasure, because Edward F. Beale's son, Truxton Beale, who was born in San Francisco, died in like 1934, and he chose to have himself entombed in the Bruton Parish churchyard, where I believe the hidden tomb of Nathaniel Bacon is. So when you go to the Bruton Parish Church to look around today, you'll also see the tomb of Truxton Beale, where his ancestor Thomas Beale, the Knight of Malta, used to worship at the church, that his family has a long history associated with that era in colonial Virginia. But also, I think we're privy to the truth of the story of Nathaniel Bacon that I told earlier. So that shows you how a lot of these things interconnect. I believe they knew about the Bruton Vault, the Beale treasure, and probably were privy to other stories, similar stories as well. And from even the Alexander family, who I mentioned were part of that Virginia history as well.
And then there's a Knights of Malta connection between also with Jefferson, is there not?
Well, some people suspect that he was a Knight of Malta.
And you and I have gone back and forth on that.
That's possible, but during his time in France, nobody really knows if he was initiated into one of the French lodges there. But during that era of French history, to become a Knight of Malta, you had to be a Freemason too.
There's no
so the only
of
real source of him being that is a poster that was printed in the 19th century that shows him being a Knight of Malta. Other than that, there's no records. The lodge in Charlottesville had a fire, and all the records from his era are missing. And some of the things about his life suggest that he may not have been a Freemason, because he was against the formation of the Society of the Cincinnati, and kind of spoke about how much control groups like that could have or be misinterpreted as having.
Right.
right when America gained their independence, and we're trying to form this new country where everybody had equal rights, or more equal rights than they had before anyway. So that could go either way. Maybe someday some records will pop up that prove that one way or the other.
Sure.
But he certainly, in his time in France, he associated with people like Louis Alexander Rochefoucauld, the son of the Duc d'Anville, who died in Nova Scotia, who printed the Declaration of Independence in French for the first time. And there's our declaration popping up again. In a story that's related to what we're all talking about. And he attended literary salons with the Marquis de Lafayette and kind of ran in this crowd of noble people in France that also wanted a republic, you know, kind of on their terms. And then the revolution came along, and unfortunately a lot of them were done away with as part of the French Revolution, and they didn't get to realize this constitutional monarchy like England had in France is what they were, you know, angling for at that time. So even Louis Alexander Rochefoucauld was killed in the Reign of Terror. But what's interesting about that is his son Francois then moved to the United States in exile for about a 3-year time, where he lived in Philadelphia, and he became a member of the American Philosophical Society, which is basically a Freemasonic associated group at that time. And he had a correspondence with Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and Benjamin Franklin. So he was well in the loop of founding fathers. And that's another possible connection between the Oak Island story and American history right there.
There you go.
So,
yeah, we had a question jumped in here. It says, I don't want to get off track, but Christopher Columbus landed in and now what's called the Providence town in Massachusetts in October, then resailed off a month later only to land again across the bay, which he didn't know, I guess, what is now known as Plymouth, Massachusetts. Was there any fact that he was Templar?
well, I'll address the Templar question first.
All right.
No, I don't think he was. Because if you look at, even if he had red crosses on his sails, Columbus was from the Republic of Genoa, who has the same flag as England with the red cross on it. So if he had red crosses on his sails, that's what he was saying, because we know later he even paid 10% of all his colonial earnings to the Republic of Genoa. So I've never heard any source or any story having Columbus having gone to where Provincetown, Massachusetts is. So I can't really address that one. I don't have any basis of reference for that story at all.
All right. Well, okay, so we're getting ready to wrap it up here, and I wanted to ask you just briefly too, what are you working on now? What's your source of keeping your interest at the moment?
Well, I'm trying to find the copy of the book I'm working on.
I'm sure it's going to be something that we need to find out about, because this will be coming down the pike here pretty soon. I would imagine.
Oh, well, I can't find it right now. Wouldn't you know? But yeah, I have a proof copy of it I've been using to edit it, but it's called Timeless Arcadia, Treasure, Myths, and Legends. Here it is. Diane's helping me. I get a real good book plug here.
All right.
So this is the proof copy I used to edit it. And that's going to be coming out soon. I'm really almost done. I'm thinking about adding one more chapter. So that's going to be out here within a week or two, even though I've been saying that for the last 2 months.
What was the name of it again? What was the name of it again?
Timeless Arcadia, Treasure, Myths, and Legends Revealed.
Oh, my goodness.
So this stands independently of my other Arcadia book about Oak Island, and is a continuation of that shows in more detail and some new examples that I found since I did the other book that kind of support the thesis of the other book. In all of this series of references to Arcadia that I've seen in these English nobles making plot elements from Philip Sidney's book, A Reality, which we didn't have time to get into. maybe next time.
Maybe next time. We're going to have you back on the show because you have so much information, and I know we didn't even get to it all. I mean, there's so many notes here, and I'm like, oh my goodness, it's
not even close. Wow.
No, we didn't. And I tell you honestly, as I mentioned this before, Cort, you have amassed so much information, and how you've realized and gone through and tied all these things together, even for us tonight. Shown us the relationships between so many different things. It kind of blows my mind, and how you were able to put all this together is just it's fascinating. But again, folks, you gotta. I mean, how many books do you have now, Cort? How many have you written now?
10.
About 10 books.
10. Yeah, I've written since about, when did I start? About 2009.
Wow.
And I deleted the first 2 because I need to re-edit them. I got pulled down the wrong rabbit hole like everybody else.
We've got to have tonight a little bit.
Which happens.
You have to go down those wrong turns because that's how you start to realize and get a feel for what is meaningful and real.
Yep.
So I have gone through some things to try to get to the point I'm at now that tell me that I'm on the right track. And what's frustrating is it really doesn't solve Oak Island. That's still a mystery. But it adds a new light onto who possibly could have been involved and what their motives were and what their values were.
Right. And I think that's something that we're all coming to understand with Oak Island. I know many people have talked about it. I've mentioned it. John's mentioned it, that the fact that, and Jack Campbell, of course, has mentioned it too, the fact that there are possibly so many different people we know there's been so many different people there. And we know that if there's things left behind there, it could very well have been from multiple sources. And that's just why Oak Island was this place, as John and I were talking about, why Oak Island could have been this place that was like a stopping point or a point where they did shipbuilding or ship repairs or a stopover point. It was naturally on that course, it seemed like, when you're coming across the ocean, it just seemed like that was a natural stopping point before you made your way down the East Coast or elsewhere. But it's why, but so many different people may have come down through there, and left something behind, or some kind of history.
Different countries, right? Different Portuguese, Spanish, English, French, you name it. Basque fishermen. It works.
Exactly.
Everybody's got a piece of the action there.
Yep. Any last points, John, before we wrap it up?
No, it's fantastic. We really appreciate your time tonight, Cort. It was fantastic.
Oh, no problem. I'm always here for you guys if you want to do this again.
Oh, we'd love to.
Some other time,
absolutely.
Yeah, like I said, we have to have you come back, and especially after that book. When you get that, would you say next week or when?
Well, hopefully it'll be finished next week, and I'll have it out within a couple of weeks for sale, and I'll let you all know.
Please do. Please let us know, and I'll make sure that we get a link up there for that, because I know a lot of people will be. I'm interested already just from listening to the title of there. You put treasure in the title, and I'm just like, what? What was that?
Right. I'm hooking you in just like the mystery.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much, Cort Lindahl, for coming and sharing a couple of hours with us here tonight and sharing some of your research with us. We certainly appreciate that very much. And John Edwards, thank you for being here with me also, because I know you and Cort talk a lot. You guys share this kind of stuff going back and forth. And you're a great researcher in your own right. So, and I appreciate your expertise on the show here tonight. Folks, this has been a great couple of hours. I know I've really enjoyed it. And don't forget, this is going to stay out on YouTube. It's going to stay on our Facebook group. It's going to be out on Twitch TV. Stay in there so you can always catch up with it later, because I'm going to have to review it more times, I think, myself, to kind of make sure I know I probably missed some stuff. Thank you so much to Linda and Jan for what you guys do out there in the chat and keeping things rolling and getting all the schedules and everything done. Appreciate you very much. And Jack Campbell, thanks for stepping aside tonight and allowing John to come on and help us out with this. Appreciate that again very much for you too, folks. Don't forget. I wanted to mention real quick too that I have now been putting these out onto the podcast platforms. We're just gonna right now. I think we're up on Podbean and Spotify and Google Podcasts. in Amazon, which is the Audible. They're all going to be there, and I will have this one posted up there as well. It's audio only, so you can go back and download it, listen to it at your leisure. It will be out there. I'll put it up there tonight. Again, if you're out there on YouTube, click that subscribe button for us. And we're also on Patreon if you want to help support the show. But again, thank you, Cort Lindahl, for being here today. We've really, really enjoyed this. And I want to say thank you for all those who came by and were listening. And we'll catch you next time right here on the Curse of Oak Island and Beyond live stream. Good night, everybody.
Good night, all.
Good night.